Thanks to each and every one of you for joining us in person here today at Maglione Hall and to those who are joining us virtually. We have an exciting afternoon here with the Honorable Federico Peña in conversation with our great Chancellor, Jeremy Haefner, about perseverance. Before we get started, of course, I would like to have our land acknowledgement. I want to take a moment in the spirit of healing and peace to acknowledge and honor the indigenous peoples of the land upon which the University of Denver stands, the Arapaho, Cheyenne, and Ute tribes. Like the history of so many institutions in the American West, ours is complex and sometimes painful. In recognition of this fact, and to underscore our commitment to inclusion and equity, we commit to listen and to affirm the stories of all of our community. Thank you. As I said earlier, we're so elated to have with us today the Honorable Federico Peña. Federico Peña is an outstanding servant leader. A few highlights of his many accolades, and we'd be here all day if I could articulate each and every one of them, but here are just a few. He's a former DU trustee and a continued supporter of the university. He became Denver's 41st mayor and first Hispanic mayor of the city in 1983 and served until 1991. Amongst his many accomplishments, and there are thousands, and I know that personally, he had led the building of Denver International Airport. He brought Denver a new convention center, the Cherry Creek Shopping Center, and an expanded library and performing arts center. He helped bring the Colorado Rockies baseball team to Denver, and he established a system to support public art and championed historic preservation. After serving as mayor, Federico was appointed as Secretary of the U.S. Department of Transportation. He additionally served as U.S. Secretary of Energy, making him the first Latino to be appointed in 2 federal cabinet positions in the history of the United States. He earned a Bachelor of Arts in Juris Doctor from the University of Texas at Austin and the University of Texas School of Law, respectively. He served as a partner with Vester Capital, a private equity firm, for approximately 15 years, and he currently serves as a senior advisor to the Colorado Impact Fund. He has dedicated many hours on several corporate boards and been involved in numerous philanthropic organizations. With that, I will hand it over to our Chancellor, Jeremy Haefner, for our conversation this afternoon. Enjoy.
Thank you, Stephanie. And thank you all for joining us, both here and of course, virtually as well. Federico, I am just delighted to have this opportunity to talk with you. Your career, which Stephanie gave a glimpse of, is absolutely astonishing how much you were able to achieve and how you achieved it. And in the short time that you and I have been engaged, I can tell energy plays a big role, you personal energy on that. But, you know, throughout today's conversation, I think we'll explore this notion of perseverance, because I think that's such a powerful message for our students to hear. And I'm so glad that you made that as a subtitle of your book. Not bad for a South Texas boy, a story of perseverance. It's a delightful book, and I couldn't put it down because it talks so much about Denver, talks so much about the history of the West, and your optimism and for such change and how you brought it with us. There's also familiar names to the University of Denver here. Catherine Archuleta and David Greenberg are 2 that come to mind, which is delightful. And I love the cover. It's got two photos of Federico now and much earlier. And that earlier picture is well, when you're quite younger, and you got a kind of an ornery look on your face there. I think it was probably portending things to come about your resiliency as a fighter. So The title, though, is really fascinating. And I was hoping that maybe you could kind of expand to the audience and tell the story of what's the significance of not bad for a South Texas boy?
I'm happy to do that. And before I do that, by the way, we agreed we'd call each other by first names. Otherwise, I would call him Chancellor, but he said, no, call me Jeremy. So first of all, let me thank you for hosting this event and for making the books available to students and to others in the university. And congratulations on your work here. Can I also thank Stephanie? Where did you go, Stephanie? Here you are, Stephanie. She worked so hard in putting this together. This is not easy to do, by the way. So Stephanie, thank you very much for all of your assistance. And you read the book too, so appreciate that. And to all of you for being here. I know it's a lunch hour, it's a Friday, you'd rather be somewhere else, so I'm honored that you took the time to be here. Let me answer your question. So when you first read the title, Not Bad for a South Texas Boy, it sounds a little bit like I'm bragging. I'm not. That is actually what my first English professor wrote when I attended the University of Texas a long time. I won't give you the exact date, on my first English composition. I got it back, and actually, I think he gave me a C+. Dot, dot, dot. You'll see the 3 dots. Not bad for a South Texas boy. And at first, I thought it was a compliment. You know how we are when we're young, and it's not till years later you think, that's kind of strange. And I know he didn't say to other students, not bad for an East Texas boy. And the fact is, I was the only Latino in the class. And back then, I will give you the date, in 1964, 65, University of Texas had 35,000 students. Today, it's 60-something thousand.
Unbelievable.
And of that population, less than 1% was a combination of African-American, Latino, Asian American, Native American students. So someone like me was pretty unusual to be seen on the campus. And I have a feeling, and I may be wrong about this, in reflecting back on what that professor wrote, he may have been surprised, Jeremy, that since I was from Brownsville, Texas, I could actually write a pretty decent English composition theme. And he probably thought, not bad for a South Texas boy. And so that's the title of the book. And all throughout my life and in the memoir, I talk about how there were other instances like that at the time I didn't understand what was happening until years later.
It's often that it's through that reflection where you really take away the learning that you have in that regard. You can almost kind of hear him maybe in a Texas drawl kind of say that out loud, and that would just be another, kind of reminder of the times that you were experiencing on that. We're gonna come back to some of those challenges and barriers throughout the conversation. But just picking up on the Texas theme, you spoke and wrote a lot about family and how important it was, and how over the course of your time, how you gradually had to leave Texas. And so the next couple of questions are on kind of that evolution. You spent a lot of time in Brownsfield and in Laredo. So, were there any values or perspectives that you really took away from your childhood times that really had a deep impact and influence on you then, and then of course today as well?
Absolutely. So I was born in Laredo, Texas, and raised in Brownsville, which is about 200 miles south along the Rio Grande, the border. And both communities were 90% Latino back in those days, and still are today. And again, reflecting years later on my experiences back then, it struck me later that my 5th great-grandfather, Tomas Sanchez, founded Laredo, Texas in 1755, before the Constitutional Convention for the United States. And all during those centuries, my ancestors were ranchers and farmers and business people and mayors and county commissioners. They fought for the Confederacy. And one of my ancestors, Santos Benavides, was the highest ranking Latino in the Confederacy.
That was surprising.
And he used to ride his horse from Laredo to Austin, Texas, to go to the first territorial legislature. So one would think that with that kind of background, my family would be treated a little differently. But for strange reasons, I always felt in Brownsville that I was a bit of a second-class citizen.
Mhm.
Even though the community was 90% Latino, the Anglo population primarily were the business people and the civic leaders and they were sort of in charge. And while there were Latinos involved in government, we finally elected the first, mayor back then. There was a feeling that I wasn't really fully accepted and appreciated, notwithstanding that deep history that we weren't immigrants. My fifth great grandfather founded Laredo on behalf of Spain. And then later it became Mexico. And then we had a war with Mexico, and my ancestors were part of the Republic of the Rio Grande, which was a state that was formed for 180 days to fight anyway. So that was what my influence was. And then when I went to Austin, Texas, and I've told you the story, I'd walk across the campus and I wouldn't hardly see anybody like me. Yeah. And I didn't say hello to many, very, many people. I was sort of feeling a little bit isolated, but I persevered. And this comes back to my family. And I have to tell all of you that I cannot say enough about my blessed mother and father who are no longer with us. They sacrificed everything for their 6 children. After I was born, I was the 3rd oldest. My mom had triplets. So my parents raised 6 children in 7.5 years. Their births in Brownsville, Texas. We all went to college.
Wow.
Sadly, 3 of us became lawyers. So I bless them and thank them because they taught me perseverance. They taught me to be proud of my background, to be proud of my heritage, to never give up, and to keep struggling in whatever I did. So those values have stayed with me all during that time.
And a work ethic, a hard worker,
Yeah.
your father was.
Yes, very.
And that came through in the narrative in a deep way.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we were deep Catholics, but my father worked on Sundays. So I remember he would take me to the post office and we'd go through the mail and do other things. And years later, I kept thinking, wait a minute, I thought we weren't supposed to work on Sundays as Catholics. But that was part of the work ethics.
Yeah. And then you did go to the University of Texas, and that was sort of the beginning of, your independence from growing up and being so close to the family. But that's also where you really began to find your roots in civil rights. The Vietnam War was ongoing, and you were quite vocal in protesting that. Tell us a little bit about that period, because that, I think, really set you up for your career as an attorney.
That's right. So I went to undergraduate school and majored in accounting until I made a D in my first accounting class. So I switched to political science. But I always wanted to become a lawyer. I wanted to become the first lawyer in my entire extended family, which was several hundred at that time. And when I finally applied to law school, I bombed the LSAT. Anybody here taking the LSAT? I won't tell you my score, because you'll probably ask me to leave. But my score was so low that the associate dean said, Federico, we can't admit you. We predict that you'll not succeed in all that. So I harassed them. And finally, I persevered. They finally let me in. There are a lot of ironies about that, which we can talk about later. But however, so when I went to law school, I wanted to be a corporate lawyer, a traditional lawyer, to make my parents proud. And a funny thing happened during that time frame. The Vietnam War was exploding, civil rights, Bull Connor, all those things were happening. And it struck me that I needed to not become a corporate lawyer, but to become a civil rights lawyer. So yes, I protested the war in Vietnam. There's a photo in the book of me with my long hair and big old sign. Protested police violence in Austin, Texas. And so I became a civil rights lawyer. My first job was working for Legal Aid in El Paso, Texas, and I was fired. After about 10 months, 4 of us were asked to leave. I guess we weren't fired, we were asked to leave. And so I moved to Denver to visit my younger brother, Alfredo, who was going to law school here. And I fell in love with the people of Colorado, the state, the beauty, and I stayed here and I became a lawyer with the Mexican-American Legal Defense and Educational Fund. It had an office here. So I was one of the attorneys involved in the first desegregation lawsuit, the Keys case. That went to the Supreme Court and it came back. It was the first tri-ethnic desegregation lawsuit in the United States, where the Supreme Court recognized that Latinos were a separate ethnic group. Because back then, believe it or not, the superintendent of DPS said, we can mix African-American and Latino students, and that's integration. Really? And we said, I don't think so. And so I was involved in that. We filed a federal case in Grand Junction against the school district there for discrimination. I was involved in police brutality cases as a MALDIF lawyer. And then we might want to talk about the transformation that happened to me.
I love this story. I love this story.
So back in 1975, I was a civil rights lawyer for the Chicano Education Project. We were trying to get more bilingual education programs in all the 181 school districts in the state. And someone said, wait a minute, rather than trying to fight each school district, why don't we get the legislature to pass a statewide law requiring bilingual education for Latino Spanish-speaking kids? So we introduced this bill in 1975. I helped write it, I testified, and a strange thing happened. I suddenly started meeting these legislators, Democrats and Republicans alike. And the bill passed, which was a surprise because it was so controversial. The Republicans had control of the Senate, Democrats had control of the House, Dick Lamb was governor. So we had a 50-50 chance, but after much compromise and days and days and days of just ugly debate, it passed. And it struck me, Jeremy, that the people in the legislature didn't have horns. And my message to a lot of young people today is, yes, demonstrate. I did it. Yeah, protest. You know, fight against injustice. But have a conversation with the institutions you're trying to fight. And we never do that. We simply assume they're all mean, racist, whatever kinds of people. And yet when you sit down and talk to them, as I did with legislators, I suddenly realized there were a lot of things we agreed on and we could compromise. And that's when I finally realized that being inside the institution is not such a bad thing. There are good people in all the institutions we are fighting, whatever they are. And after that experience and the bill passed, some legislators came to me and said, Federico, you did a good job. Why don't you run for the legislature?
Yeah.
And the rest, as we say, is history.
And then you became minority leader.
Yep.
And had to work with the majority, which was Republican at that time.
Right.
And I think you changed people's perspectives of who you were, but also what was possible, because you worked very closely with Representative Ron Strand, I think.
Ron Straley was my counterpart. It's an interesting story. So when I was elected minority leader after my first term, which was very unusual, the media and others were saying he's a firebrand. Yeah, you know, because he's this crazy civil rights lawyer who's going to burn the Capitol down. And so they appointed Ron Straley, who was this very sophisticated, learned lawyer who'd been in the legislature for a long time. And he was my counterpart. We were supposed to box together. And it turned out that we became good friends. And we got a lot done. And people then reflected later on that the impression they had of me was completely wrong, and that I could work with someone like Ron. And one of the reporters said it was fun listening to Ron and Federico speak at the podium because it was like two prize debaters debating public policy. And that decorum, that respect that we brought to the body was something that I was very proud of. I worked with Senator Al Mickeljohn, who is a Republican, to amend the school finance law. Very complicated law. Worked with others. So we found a way to work on both sides of the aisle. And of course, we had a Democratic governor, which helped. But the point is, for a lot of young people today, don't give up on these institutions. Yeah, there's some bad people in institutions. I'm sure there's some questionable people everywhere, right? But there are a lot of good people who are there because they want to do good. They want to serve. They've taken time to serve in the legislature or to serve as a county commissioner or for us as a school board member. God, how hard is that these days? Isn't it? I mean, who wants to be a school board? Who wants to be a policeman these days or a police person, police officer these days? We've got to change that attitude by having conversations with people on the inside and say, how can we work together? Now, can we agree 100% of the time? No, but probably 75 or 80% of the time, I think we can reach agreement on lots of things and get things done once and for all, rather than this all the time. I learned that the hard way, but I continued that perspective in my life. And I try to tell people today, with the divisiveness we have in the United States today, we can't continue to do this. We've got to learn to talk to one another and to share and I say there, sometimes it's painful. I have relatives who I disagree with politically, but we figure out a way to get along and talk about things we agree on, at least. Because we keep forgetting that we're Americans. And the people who are laughing at us right now are in Russia, the leaders of Russia, the leaders of China. They like it when we're divided. This is great for them. And we lose sight of that. We're so busy doing this. So my message to young people is talk to those people in the institutions. If you're mad at the police department, meet with the chief of police. Talk about how we can recruit better police officers. You know, I met with some division chiefs the other day, and I was saying to them, you know, I see these ads about join the Marines, you know, or Air Force or whatever, and it's proud. I said, what kind of ads would you run about joining the police department? And there was this sign of confusion.
Yeah.
So what message would you have if you wanted to encourage, because now people don't want to become police officers, or teachers in some cases.
Same story.
So we've got to get a different message out to people about what is valuable and honorable about being a police officer or a teacher or whatever, and get back to this unity concept and not keep fighting each other all the time.
It's such an important message. And it's so powerful to have you say it, because no one can argue about what you were able to accomplish when you took that approach, right?
Yeah.
I mean, as Stephanie mentioned, there's so many things, and the book goes into even more, but it pales in comparison to the totality of what you've been able to do. So the power of talking and dialogue and listening carefully, and yes, even compromise, give and take in order to really get some things done is really, really powerful. And I love that transformation that you describe in your book. And I think that's why I love these two pictures, right? The Federico before and the Federico after, right? And it's just a great, powerful message. The quote in the book that is in this line about dialogue is really a nice one to share with everyone. So I'm going to read it. It says, "Our soul will be discovered through honest and direct dialogue, which may at times emit anger, resentment, and tears. But these conversations and interactions can bring a new level of mutual respect and even love for one another." That's wonderful. And I couldn't agree with more. And, you know, in today's environment, you know, we're challenged at the university, we're challenged in the city of Denver, we're challenged in the state of Colorado and the nation around this ability to have meaningful, empathetic dialogue where you're truly trying to listen across differences and have an appreciation, maybe not coming to agreement, but at least being able to listen to it. This is really important for a university, because it is at the university where students need to be exposed to those skills and learn them so that they can lead these lives of purpose and really be contributing members of our society in a deep way. So is there specific advice that based on your experience that you would give to our students or our faculty or staff that would help them navigate, you know, difference of opinions, dialogue that makes them uncomfortable? What advice would you have?
Well, it's a bit about what I said earlier. And by the way, that quote where I talk about our soul, I was talking about the soul of our nation. Because people talk about, for example, President Biden says he wants to fight for the soul of our country, the soul of our nation. Well, what is the soul of our nation? It's different things to different people. But unless we have a conversation about that, you know, what do you think the soul is? What do you think the soul is? And we have a conversation. Well, I think the soul of our nation is we have a great educational system, or where everybody gets a good, decent paying job, or where we have safety, or where I can raise a family. Let's have a conversation about what is the soul of America, that we are leaders in the world or not, that we are the greatest economy or not. What is the soul of the nation? That comes from conversation, from dialogue. And I remember we've all read about how, you know, our Constitution was developed by the framers and the debates they had, massive debates. And yet they found compromise. And now that document is the finest in the world. People try to emulate it because they had those tough conversations. We need to do that again. We need to do it civilly and with respect. And that means that when I'm talking to someone that I know I disagree with, I cannot make assumptions about their background. I don't know their background. I don't know how they were raised. I don't know what their parents taught them or did not teach them. I don't know if they were abused or not. And so you have to have these conversations with a completely open mind and honestly assume that the person wants to have a dialogue with you and tell you how they were raised, what their values are, why they have their own prejudices. I have prejudices. And have a conversation about that. And I fundamentally believe we will agree on 75% of the things. We would not have built the airport had I not gone to Adams County and talked to the Adams County commissioners and said, all right, if you don't want us to build the airport over in the Rocky Mountain Arsenal, where do you want us to build it? He said, move it. And I said, well, where? Just move it. So we moved it to Kansas. You're laughing. The young lady in the back is laughing. The point I'm making is we sat down and listened. Why do you hate Denver so much? Oh, you guys always get your way and you always dump things in Adams County. We've got the gravel pits and blah, blah. We don't have anything positive. How'd you like to have an airport in your backyard? Oh, well, that's interesting. But we have to have the land. It has to be annexed. It has to be part of Denver. I don't want a metropolitan organization running the airport. Let's compromise. And we sat and we talked, and the negotiations went on for months and months. But I have to tell you, back then, nobody thought we could do it. No one thought we could do it. They thought we were crazy. Why are you having a conversation with Adams County about moving the airport to Kansas? You know,
Everyone was expecting it where it was in the.
when I ran for mayor, I took the position we should expand it north onto the Rocky Mountain Arsenal, keep Stapleton. That would have been a horrendous mistake because we learned later it would have cost billions of dollars to clean up the Rocky Mountain Arsenal that had weapons buried in the ground that had never been cleaned up. And we would have continued to bombard Denver and Aurora with noise. We already had 65,000 people who were living who were violating the noise corridors. So can you imagine? Had we had 7 runways at Stapleton today, you couldn't even drive there. The traffic would have been so terrible. So the point I'm making is we sat down and we listened and we negotiated, and yes, we compromised. That really terrible word, compromise, right? It's a bad word. Can't compromise. Yes, you can. If you want to get things done, you've got to compromise. And I brought those values to those issues, and we have to continue them today in whatever we do. And you know what? We're not going to agree the first time. We didn't agree the first time with Adams County. We had negotiations for months, before we finally reached agreement. But we got it done. We were persistent. And we all believe in the same thing. Let's build a real asset that will be an asset both for Adams County and for Denver and the entire state. And today, DIA is the most important asset in Colorado. The economic impact of DI in terms of the billions and billions of dollars and the 45,000 people who work out there, the most important asset would not have occurred unless we made those compromises and those judgments. And the same is true what I said earlier, to make America greater in this new century, we've got to find a way to compromise among ourselves as Americans, not as Westerners or Easterners or urbanites versus rural people or whatever, as Americans, and say, how do we make this country greater in this century so that we don't get overcome by our enemies? And we do have enemies. I may not like to call them that, but we do have enemies. And if you look at the history of the world, there's always been conflict, right? Between one group and another group and geopolitical. And that hasn't changed because we are who we are. But let's get back as Americans and compromise and do the things we need to do.
Well, and that one cannot understate, one cannot overstate the impact that DIA has had, right? And you mentioned a couple, but really it has put us on the international map because now we're open to the world here.
Exactly.
And I think the University of Denver has benefited from that just because it's made it so much easier for our students who, 70% of them do study abroad all over the world, travel around. Our faculty and staff benefit from it. But more generally, I think there's been an infusion of international people that have come and lived in Denver or visited Denver, and that has made a huge change in our perspective here. We're not this local sort of Western town anymore. We're a big player. So that and one can point to, Lodo that you also transformed, the Central Platte area of Denver that you transformed. And in all of those conversations in your book, you talk about this wasn't done overnight. There were lots and lots of negotiation, conversations, and listening deeply about what was meaningful to that other side, and how could you come to compromise or an agreement on that. But there must have been along the way, I know there was because I read about it in your book, lots of times when you were personally attacked, right? Personally, maybe because of your ethnic background or where you're from South Texas. How can you help our students and our faculty and our staff and all of us here appreciate those microaggressions and macroaggressions that you must have experienced, and how you persevered through those? Because that's hard.
It is hard. One thing I write about in the book that many people don't know about is when I was sworn in as mayor on July 1 of 1983, I had to wear a bulletproof vest. There were so many death threats against me at that time. And, I didn't want to do it, but my security detail, God bless them, they said, if anything ever happens to you, we will not be able to live with ourselves. So, and there were lots of those kinds of threats when I was mayor, and we won't go into all those details. But to answer your question, I think the way I was raised helped me understand that you have to respect other people even when they hate you. And maybe respect is the wrong word. I guess I could have said love, harder word. But we need to be able to address lack of civility with more civility. And I take the words of Dr. Martin Luther King and others who've always said, you've got to rise above the hate. And I believe that when one does that, you always prevail. It may take a long time, but you always prevail. So my message to people today who are suffering that kind of abuse is rise above it. Continue to work hard at what you are doing. Believe in yourself. Try to continue to love other people around you. And just know that ultimately good will prevail. That's hard to accept when you're getting beaten up.
Yeah.
How can good prevail when I had gash in my? It's hard when not that happened to me, but for others who are going through that kind of terror, how can you continue to have hope? But I'm always impressed with people who've gone through such tragedy, and at the end of the day, they say things like, "I forgive the other person." That's amazing. We've got to learn to do that even more. And continue the dialogue that you've talked about, that international travel, which I think is so important. We know so little about the world. And so the more that we learn about other cultures and other religions and other parts of the world, now we know about Ukraine. How many people knew about Ukraine? Up until a few months ago, very few of us. So that interaction, and the same is true with people in the United States. We need to travel more within our state and get to know people in the rural communities that oftentimes we don't even talk to or see and understand them. And the same is true with the country. So rising above hate, rising above the kinds of personal attacks that come to all of us in one form or another is, I think, the only way we can survive and succeed.
As Chancellor, you bring up a really good point about getting to know the state of Colorado here, because we're both urban and rural. And Colorado isn't the only state that needs to grapple with this, but this divide between the urban and the rural worries me, in the sense that are we doing enough to really be inclusive across all different kinds of differences? And that means reaching out to the rural parts that don't have access to higher education as easily as they do in the urban areas, and really meeting their needs as well. Because if we don't, I think we just end up continuing to polarize our country even more. So I digress from the stories, but you did touch on a really important point. before we get into your work as Secretary of Transportation and then Secretary of Energy, which is fascinating, I also want to thank you because your role in bringing the Denver Marathon to Denver was, but I was deeply impressed with your time when you ran it, 3 hours and 18 minutes. Okay. I'm pretty sure that would have qualified for the Boston Marathon, which is pretty stringent. So
I have a funny story about that. So you're right. That was not a bad time for someone who was a little busy and having difficulty training. But one of the newspapers, I won't mention the newspaper, actually wrote that my time was 3 hours and 18 minutes, but I came in 100 and something places behind the first place runner. So it was sort of a backhanded compliment. Why did you come back so far behind the first place winner? But you put up with those things. You learn that, okay, a little slight, but you keep going and pay attention to it. I didn't write that in my book, I don't think. No, I left it
well,
out.
you would have beat me, that's for sure. Let's turn to your time as Secretary of Transportation. Before today's conversation, you and I were talking about the technology that you brought while you were Secretary of Transportation. It might be interesting to the audience just to talk a little bit about the global positioning systems, because we take that for such granted right now when we Google how to get down to downtown Denver, right? What's the quickest way?
Well, it was my belief back in the 90s that we had a number of choices in dealing with our infrastructure, and particularly transportation. We could continue to pour concrete and steel and just build and build and build and build, or we could use technology to try to move people and goods and services much more efficiently with technology. And we had some back then. So one of them was this thing called GPS, Global Positioning Satellite Systems. It was controlled by the military, by the Defense Department for security reasons. And people kept saying, we could use this as civilians. So I approached Secretary of Defense and said, can we take a sliver of GPS and build a security wall so that we don't interfere with the military aspects of GPS, the satellite system, and use it for civilian purposes? And it was a lot of negotiation, but we got it done. And so in the 90s, we finally opened up GPS to civilian use. And today it's everywhere. But there's so many applications like that, like Defense Department usage, that has been transferred to civilian use that has been so important. People joke about the internet. I know that Al Gore said he invented the internet. Al, are you listening? But the internet was actually being used by nuclear scientists in the Department of Energy. And that's the way they were constructing nuclear weapons and nuclear bombs, using this thing called the internet back then. It was all military stuff. And finally, someone said, how do we transfer the internet to civilian use? And you can think of time and technology after technology after technology that has been invented and used by the Defense Department that is now used for civilian purposes. And that was one, the GPS.
Yeah.
But there were many other. Back then in 1990, I gave a speech, which I talk about in the book, about how someday we'd be able to, on our phones or something, be able to figure out how we were moving from one place to another, and the weather and transportation, all these kinds of technologies that were just surfacing back then. And today they're just part of our lives. So we've got to continue to invest in technology, I think. And I know that you've got a big background in technology. I think all of you know that about the Chancellor. And so he really believes in this, but I do too. And sometimes as a nation, we forget to invest in our domestic, because we have the finest entrepreneurs, the best thinkers in the world. Those are Americans. We are geniuses when it comes to inventing new things. But oftentimes we don't get the support from the government. And some people say, no, you can't do that because you're interfering with the private sector, or you're selecting winners and losers. Please. Yeah, let's support US entrepreneurs so that technology doesn't go to China or to Europe or to Russia, which by the way does. And we won't get into that discussion.
But that speech was prescient for really predicting what the future could look like. There's another time in your career when you were a Secretary of Energy, and this is almost 25 years ago. You were concerned about Russia and its energy practices 25 years ago.
Yeah.
Fast forward, we have the Ukraine invasion by Russia. Just yesterday, Germany announced that it is willing now to consider shutting off oil coming from Russia. That's a big step for Germany because of its dependence on Russian oil. Talk to us a little bit about what you saw way back then and your concerns about that and how it is playing out 25 years later.
Well, back in the 1990s, a lot of US companies were investing in Russia in oil exploration. And they were having problems because the regional provinces were basically, I don't want to use the word extort, but trying to get more money from them by way of concession. So I went to Russia, the Soviet Union, to get the government to be more receptive and to not allow the regional provinces to do this to US companies. So we fought that big battle. But then more importantly, we realized that there was this area called the Caspian Sea, surrounded by Iran, Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, Georgia, etc. And the Caspian Sea was rich in oil and gas deposits. And the Russians had been using the Caspian Sea for years to develop oil. And the Iranians wanted oil and gas to be piped out of the Caspian Sea through Iran to Europe. And I went back there and I said, no, that's not a good thing. We don't want these pipelines going through Iran. And secondly, we need alternative pipelines to provide gas and oil for Europe, basically. And so we came up with a second pipeline to compete with the Russian pipeline, which went from Baku to Georgia, to Turkey, and then to Europe. That was back in the 1990s, because we realized back then that we could not allow Europe to be so dependent on Russian control of gas and oil and pipelines. Sadly, some European nations didn't listen, and they became overly dependent on Russia, particularly for gas. Germany is probably the worst case, but so is Europe. 30% of Europe is importing gas from Russia and lots of oil, and now they're paying the price for that. So we've tried over the years to say to our European friends, there's a better way of providing you with energy without having to rely on unstable and unfriendly countries. And now we're learning the hard truths of that. So I tried that back in the 1990s. That pipeline was finally built, but it was years later.
Oh, was it? Yeah.
It was finally built under Bush's administration, which is great. There was a continuity of policy, which, by the way, we don't have enough of in the United States. People always complain we don't have an energy policy, and that's partially correct. Although when I was Secretary of Energy, I had to develop a national energy strategy and submit it to the Congress. And every Secretary of Energy has to do that every 2 or 3 years. But the problem is the succeeding administrations don't follow it. So this is our energy policy, depending on who's president. And so we have no consistency. You go to China, this is their energy policy. And then they're doing it for 20, 30, 40, 50 years. Same policy, going in the same direction. And we're zigzagging and we're changing our minds. Are we going to produce or not produce? Drill, baby, drill. No, shut them all down. And getting back to what I said earlier, there's no compromise. And in my book, I talk about, let's sit down with the oil and gas companies, with the environmental community, with US companies, and let's figure out a way to, over 20 or 30 years, develop a policy that allows us to transition slowly to clean energy, convert the oil and gas companies to energy companies, not oil and gas companies, but to energy companies, allow them to continue to produce in the meantime, but we can transition if we do it methodically year after year after year, and we can do this and finally become energy secure. And I talk about in the book, we could reduce our imports to 10% instead of 30 or 35%, which is we're still doing today. We're still importing Russian oil up until about 8 months ago. Lukoil, any of you seen Lukoil in the Northeast? That's a Russian company. For a long time, we were importing and still do Venezuelan oil, Citgo. Even though you had a crazy guy running Venezuela for a while. We've decreased our dependence on Venezuelan oil, and now we're no longer importing Russian oil. But our strategy is never one of decades investment and consistency. And that's one of the problems we have in not having a consistent energy policy. And Europe has the same problem. But we can figure that out if we work together.
So I'm going to jump out of the questions I was going to ask you, because I want to go to one of the questions that was submitted by the audience, because it's right in that space, because it's really a wonderful question. And I don't know who asked it, but I'm going to read it verbatim. Many Americans have a blanket belief that low taxes are a good thing and that government cannot do things well. So they don't want to give money to the government in taxes. We have underinvested in infrastructure, in education, public health, and the environment, especially addressing climate change, which is going to be costly. Is it possible, they ask, to change the culture in the US around taxation rates, which are the lowest they've been in decades, and complexity of the tax code so that we can invest in this country for the public, not just the individual good.
Yes. Let me explain that. And I'm going to use the Denver example. And I talk about this in the book, about how we did things in Denver during a recession and how Washington needs to learn about how we did things here in the Denver metropolitan area. So let me take you back to 1980s when I was elected mayor in 1983. Within a year, we were in the worst recession in the history of the city. Our unemployment rate was 2% above the national average. Our vacancy rate of first-class office space in Denver was 30%. We had record bankruptcies and record foreclosures. Every sector of the Colorado economy was in the tank. I became mayor. And I had this vision of building a new airport and a convention center and all these things that cost money. So we did two things. One is I cut. So my salary, I took a 10-day leave without pay. My cabinet took, I think, 7 days leave without pay. And many of the city employees took a 5-day cut. So I said to the people of Denver, we're willing to cut. We're willing to tighten the belt. We're going to use your current tax dollars more efficiently. But by the way, I'm going to need your help to do some other things. So if we want to rebuild the viaducts and the bridges that were falling apart in Denver, which they were, their sufficiency ratings were very low in terms of national ratings. They were dangerous. One viaduct almost fell down. I said, we're going to have to increase your property taxes. In the middle of a recession, when your property values have decreased. But this is what I did, Jeremy. We don't do enough of this. This is what I say to our leaders in Washington. I did, I think, 110 town meetings all over the city, explaining to people why we needed to increase their property taxes to build the viaducts and rebuild the streets, because if we didn't do it then, and we waited 10 years later, it was going to cost 20 or 30% more. And better to do it now, even though times were tough, and increase your property taxes. And guess what? All 10 of the items passed. All 10 of them passed in the middle of a recession. The most controversial one was air conditioning the city and county building, my office. It passed by 55%, something like that. Building a new airport in the middle of a recession. I did all these meetings all over the city to explain Airport 101 economics, because people did not understand that their property taxes and sales taxes didn't go to the old Stapleton. Old Stapleton was built and financed with airport revenue bonds that are backed by the revenue at the airport, not in the city. And so I spent all this time explaining to people, when we build a new airport, we're not going to increase your property taxes or your sales taxes. It's going to be fuel taxes on the airlines, landing fees, concession revenue, parking revenue. I guess if you park there, you're going to pay a higher parking revenue. But it's a self-sustaining economic engine that's going to finance the airport revenue bonds. But I spent time explaining that to people, and people are fundamentally smart. They get it if you give them the facts. And they voted yes on the airport, both here and in Adams County. The problem is, and I tell this to my friends in Washington, get out of Washington. Travel. Explain things to people. Explain why we have to revise the tax code, why we have to ask more of multi-billionaires who pay no tax at all, and why that's fundamentally unfair, and how there were times when we had a much higher tax rate and our economy was booming. And talk about the need for investment in education, in healthcare, and environment, and infrastructure. And those things are going to pay off, but you have to spend time talking to people, because people are busy. They're trying to survive. They're dealing with all kinds of issues. They don't read up on these things. They don't have time. We don't do enough of that.
Yeah.
In traveling around the country and explaining to people, why do we need a new energy policy? This is the way it's going to work. And by the way, if we're going to increase your taxes, so this is what I did in Denver, it's going to go to the 15th Street Viaduct. It's going to go to that street. It's going to go to that park. I'll tell you exactly where the money's going to go. I'm not telling you just give me all this money and trust me. No, we were very specific on where the money was going to go, and people could touch it and see it. Oh yeah, we need to redo that street. That's in my neighborhood. And we did it fairly throughout the city. We don't do enough of that at the federal level. We don't explain to the American public how their tax dollars are going to be used and that they're not going to be wasted. So the answer is yes, whoever asked the question. I have hope in that, but we've got to do a much better job of getting out there and talking to people.
You know, and one thing that we haven't talked about, but I think was part of your incredible success, right? yes, you can go out there and talk, but you have to have people show up. And I think your whole career, especially when you became mayor, and you brought in a sense of optimism. You brought in a sense that we're going to do things differently, that we were actually going to engage the citizens in focus groups and conversations and really get their ideas and their input. And that's probably your greatest accomplishment, because it literally changed how Denverites looked at their city. It was kind of the old guard, the old boys network, right? You brought in this fresh perspective here. And would you agree that how
Absolutely.
important that was?
Absolutely. And recall back in those days, the strong mayors of the country just made decisions by themselves. There wasn't a lot of community input. We're just going to do this and end the story. And I had a very different view. My view was, no, we're not going to do that, because I used to be a member of 2 neighborhood groups, and we were always mad at the city because the city wouldn't listen to us. And so we said, if we're going to do this, I'm going to bring in people, have them form committees on how do we do the infrastructure. I had 100 citizens or so develop the infrastructure package for the voters, and it all passed. But every time we had an issue, I brought in people and said, I need your ideas. Let's do this together. And they did that. Now, by the way, I was criticized for that. The newspapers wrote things like, why do you always have to bring in these people to help you make a decision? Why don't you just make a decision, darn it? Do it yourself like the old mayor. I said, no, that's not me. That's not me. I'm going to involve people. And that's how we got so much done, by people giving us their ideas. Then they were bought in. And so when it was put on the ballot, they could go out and tell their neighbors, wait a minute, I was on that committee. I know exactly how it was done. We did it fairly, and it was done wisely, and I'm supporting it, and I'm going to ask you to support it. And that's why so much got done. Before I was mayor, Denver was known as a cannot do city. And Chicago was known as a can do city. The reason we were called a cannot do city is because on 2 different occasions, the people of the Denver metro area voted down light rail twice. People didn't trust RTD, and it became an elected board. Back then, it was an appointed board. And they were going to Paris and looking at light rail systems, drinking champagne, and all this kind of stuff. So people got mad, and they voted it down twice. So we were known as a cannot do city. You can't do anything in Denver. Nothing works. People don't vote for anything. We've completely turned that around. Do you realize we have more metropolitan districts in this state than any other community in the United States? Scientific Facilities District, sports stadium, baseball stadium, RTD, metro sewage, the agreement reached on the airport. I'm leaving some out. But we figured out a way to break the walls down of the metro area and work together as a metropolitan community. Because I believe in Jane Jacobs' book, where she wrote, it is the regions of the world that are going to compete, not the cities of the world. So it's the Denver metropolitan region that's going to compete with the Mexico City region that has 25 million people. And once we started to understand that as a metropolitan community, we started to work together and get a lot of things done, which people thought we could not do. So bringing people into the conversation, taking their ideas, listening to them, and respecting their ideas. So when they proposed to me, I don't know how many items for the infrastructure proposal, I accepted 98% of them.
Nice.
So they knew their time was not wasted. I wasn't going to put their ideas on a shelf.
That's a huge change. That's a huge change.
Yeah.
All right, we're almost out of time, but I have to get to this last piece. So one of the wonderful things about your book was you end many chapters with the sentence, and then the phone rang. Then the phone rang. So the story is of how you were convinced to run for Denver mayor. You got calls from good people that you trusted, and they called you and they invited you to have a meal down in one of the local restaurants. After your time in mayor, you got a phone call, from Al Gore saying, would you consider the Secretary of Transportation? And you were really wanting to get back to your private practice at that time. And so you said, no, I'm not interested. You hung up the phone, and then 2 minutes later, you get a call from President Clinton. And then it happened again for the Department of Energy as well. So how are you thinking about your phone right now? as we come to 2024.
It's off. It's off.
I think there's a lot of people who would be interested in your leadership, your style, your character, coming back to the national scene. And from a selfish university point of view, to have a former trustee member become president of the United States would be pretty awesome, I think.
You're safe. Don't worry. Thank you for the,
Well,
innuendo.
Federico, this has been absolutely delightful, and so powerful for our community here. Your legacy at the University of Denver is not just with the Board of Trustees and your endearing support of the university. It's also because you were the founder of the Latino Leadership Institute, and we were the proud incubator of that. And now it's going off and doing tremendous things, and its potential is unlimited, thanks to the leadership that's there. So for so many reasons, we have deep ties to you. You inspire us. You make us proud. You give us confidence and courage to tackle the grand challenges that lie ahead. And so I just want to thank you for this really wonderful opportunity to present and have a conversation with us. And I know that Stephanie is going to come on up and kind of close us up, because there's this theme of perseverance, I think.
Perseverance. And as you all leave, I just want you to continue to think about the concept of perseverance, the concept of talking across difference, really meeting people in their own spaces to have those tough conversations. And Federico, just please know that your invitation to our campus is always extended. We could talk to you many, 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 many hours. And we thank you on behalf of everybody that was a part of pulling this together. There was a team of us, not just myself. And so we all say thank you, and thank you to our Chancellor for allowing us to host you this afternoon.
Thank you very much. Thank you. That's great. Really appreciate it. Thank you. Thank you all very much for coming. Appreciate it.